Tonight on WindowWorks, Channel 11 showcase featuring films and videos created by independent producers Ruth's Journey. A woman remembers her mysterious grandmother, Ruth, who had a passion for collecting exquisite antiques. Ruth's Winnetka mansion, filled with over 70 years of antiques, amazed collectors, but few knew of her inner troubles that kept her distant from the outside world.
Once she dreamed of seeing the world. But somewhere, somehow, my grandmother and her dreams got lost. All that's left is a story.
When Chicago area multimillionaire Ruth Flower died a year and a half ago, she left behind a collection of antiques. And what a collection it is. Frank Matthey has this old story.
Movers have just about emptied the 32-room mansion, and by the time they're finished, they will have filled 14 trucks. 14 truckloads headed for and then unloaded at Leslie Hindman Auctioneers on Ohio Street. If you can think of an item, it's probably here in this unbelievable Ruth Flower collection.
This is just enormous, and I don't remember ever seeing more property from one person.
Ruth Flower started collecting as a young woman. Then she got married. Then 40 years ago, she and her husband moved into this Winnetka mansion. She spent the last 4 decades filling it from side to side, top to bottom. The place was bulging. It took them over 2 months to catalog the 10,000-plus items. One of the problems was that she never bought just one of anything. It was lots of everything. Before she died, 90-year-old Ruth Flower collected for over 70 years, and her husband never complained. But then again, it was her money. Frank Matthey, Channel 7, Eyewitness News.
My grandmother loved these things so much. She didn't want to let go of them. It's like sharing secrets. People came from all over the world. So many people. And they were so curious. Who was Ruth Flower? Why did she do this? They wanted to know her secrets. She would have hated this. Sometimes when I came to visit, I'd find her standing perfectly still in the sunroom, staring out at the lake. It took her a moment to realize I was there. I wonder what she was thinking of. Ruth was always busy, cleaning, making repairs, working in the yard. I can't imagine her anywhere else. I wonder how she got here. Ruth Barbara Kreutzer was born July 29th in 1902. She was smart and exuberant like her father, Hermann. Elizabeth, her shy, quiet mother, didn't understand at all why her daughter wanted to sail around the world. Ruth loved the water. It was mysterious and powerful. It had a life of its own. She remembered riding in the first car, and the smell of fresh-cut wood at the lumber company where Hermann worked. In 1911, she waited at a neighbor's house while her mother was in labor at home. If it was a boy, they'd run a flag up the pole. And that's how she knew she had a new brother, Raymond. And with a son to follow in his footsteps, Ruth's father had all he could ask for. They were all so lucky. After she was gone, what I noticed first was the silence. She had hundreds of clocks. And every day while she did the chores, she wound every last one of them. Strange things started happening here. I called them incidents. When a group of people came to look at the collection, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune tried to look through a telescope on the porch when a voice spoke to her out of thin air. "Don't you touch that." Others told of locked doors that opened by themselves. Of a radio that turned on and off as it pleased. A feeling as if someone was looking over their shoulder the entire time they were there. It didn't surprise me at all. My grandmother didn't like a lot of people in her house. She was afraid they'd take something. I tried to tell her, "They can't take anything away from you now." She breezed through high school in 3 years, beating the school principal's own daughter for valedictorian. A girl who had never really been anywhere. She was so curious about the world. Ruth said to her father, "I want to go to college." Why don't you just get married like a normal girl? What could she do? but enroll herself. In 1919, Ruth entered Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. She was lucky. Her father didn't really care if she was smart or not. It wasn't important what she did. But Ruth got an idea. She was so impressed by wealth. Grand houses and fancy clothes. People who had seen the world. They seemed to have the respect of everyone. Ruth decided she'd like a mink coat. And she got what she wanted. In 1923, she graduated with honors, a French major. Though she never did go to France, and no one can ever recall hearing her speak it. I found her old date book in a box. In it she'd written, "Tout vient à qui sait attendre." Good things come to those who wait. I found her old pictures at the back of a closet. It wasn't the face I knew at all. It makes me wonder, what will I look like when I'm old? Ruth wanted to be somebody. So she picked a man with good prospects and excellent credentials. And in the late 1920s, she became Mrs. Daniel Garrity. Daniel Jr. came along. Then in 1935, the twins, Keith and Sis. They weren't Catholic, but Ruth put them in the Catholic school because it would take them at a younger age than any other. She was out and about a lot in those days, but the kids, they managed pretty well on their own. She started buying antiques. Her first purchase was a fake. It never happened again. People were so impressed by her things. How lovely. You're so lucky. But relatives saw something else. At family gatherings, Ruth sat silently, knitting and knitting. But no one said anything. Best not to ask. Maybe Ruth was finally settling down. Who knew?
You're drunk.
Shut your mouth.
Dirty, drunken Irishman.
Damn it, you come out of there.
Go away. Go away.
Who knew? Ruth didn't want to be Mrs. Daniel Garrity anymore. She divorced him in the early 40s, erased her mistake. I've never seen his face. I wonder what my grandfather looked like. A dream of her father woke her up in the middle of the night. She went to his house, still in her nightgown. He was desperately trying to open the windows. Her father was having a heart attack. He couldn't breathe. Her father left Ruth an inheritance. It was like a second chance. Money makes people pay attention to you. And with her money, she was going to get the life and the respect she wanted. She became Mrs. Wallace Flower in 1945. Wally was a successful, well-respected man. He left a wife and son in Philadelphia. They were his past. They had no place in Ruth's present, so they were erased. In 1946, Ruth and Wally moved into the house on the hill. She said she wanted the house to entertain in, but she never did. She was afraid things would get broken. They traveled a lot in those days. She combed shop after shop looking for treasures no one else recognized. Sometimes at house sales, she'd go in first thing with a stack of sold tags in her pocket. If she saw an item she thought she might like, she'd put a sold tag on it, so she could take her time making up her mind. The dealers became like family. You couldn't go into a shop in the East or the Midwest where they didn't know her. She never came home empty-handed. Her sons Dan and Keith were handsome and charming, and Sis was beautiful and ladylike. Sis met my father, Davis H., and since he had good prospects and excellent credentials, Ruth gave her enthusiastic blessing to the engagement. She wanted her daughter to be somebody, and so her daughter became Mrs. D.H. Roenisch. It was a fairy tale come true. It was exactly what she wanted. Ruth, that is. By the early 60s, everything was as Ruth had planned. This is where I come in. I was the youngest of all the grandchildren. Ruth adored us. She knitted us the most beautiful sweaters. It wasn't like Ruth's, but our house was nice too, full of antiques. People admired them. How lucky you are. Mom was out and about a lot in those days, but we managed pretty well on our own. I wasn't allowed in the living room because I might break something. After I broke a vase in the dining room, I wasn't allowed in there either. I was really careful after that. This was the only home I had, and there weren't that many rooms left. In the mid-70s, my mom woke up one day and looked around at her house full of things and felt completely empty. She realized the plans she'd made were someone else's. She divorced my dad. But Ruth's fairy tale didn't include divorce. She lashed out at my mom in the custody hearings, calling her an unfit mother. And after that, they didn't speak a word to each other for 10 years. When Mom got remarried in the early 80s, Ruth drove to her house while Mom was in church and took back all the furniture and paintings she'd ever given her as gifts. Mom waited for years for her chance to get them back. And when Ruth went into the hospital after a stroke in 1990, Mom drove to Ruth's house, and that was that. By the early 90s, Ruth's oldest son, my Uncle Dan, was an alcoholic. I didn't really know him because he'd left a long time ago after some fight with Ruth. After her stroke, he came around again, mostly to see where he stood inheritance-wise. I didn't know my Uncle Keith either. He went crazy before I was born. Schizophrenia, they said, but they weren't sure. By the time I arrived, he wasn't Keith anymore. When my oldest brother was a teenager, he began to have mental problems like Keith's. He moved into Ruth's house and lived there 15 years. Even after she died, he wouldn't leave. The police had to come and remove him. Towards the end, I think Ruth was beginning to see the world more clearly. She picked up a large spiny pine cone off the windowsill in the kitchen and held it up with genuine admiration. Now this is a masterpiece. I think when she looked at the lake, it reminded her of that time when she wanted to sail around the world. She was still a girl who'd never really gone anywhere. They pretty much stopped taking pictures years ago, but I did find one roll left in a camera. I had it developed. When Ruth had a stroke in 1990, Mom found her on the floor of the sunroom. Ruth survived. Within a year, with typical determination, she learned to talk again, to swallow again, to walk again. Her nurse Mary was genuinely kind and took great care with her. Ruth held her hand and said, "Oh, I'm so lucky." In February that year, her son Keith was bitten by a mosquito and contracted spinal meningitis. He died 5 days later. 10 days after that, her other son Dan had a fight with his wife and drove to Ruth's house. He got drunk. His liver failed. And he died. It was the only time I ever saw her cry. She died 1 week later, on March 5th, 1991. My mother lives in a big house decorated with antiques. But even though she survives, she looks so tired. That's Ruth's husband, Wally. His mind slipped with age. He didn't know where he was in the end. It must have been frightening. It was so easy to get lost in that house. Once when I came to visit, Ruth was pulling weeds out of the hillside. She said, "I like to be alone. Do you?" It was a Monday night, and I was in Los Angeles making a TV commercial. I called the hospital at 11 p.m. Chicago time. The nurse said Ruth was still awake, so I said to the nurse, "Tell her I love her." She died at 2 a.m., just 3 hours later. It took a 4-day auction to sell everything. The first day, the crowds were so thick, the only way we could get onto the floor was the fire stair.
Everybody, of course, knows that bidding is by paddle only. If you're worried, if the people over there are worried about being seen, don't worry. If you see that someone else is having trouble bidding, just yell. We'll see the bid for sure. With all of that, we'll start bidding on lot number 1, which is the Queen Anne walnut dropping table. We'll start bidding here at $1,300. I have $1,300, so I have $1,400. I have $1,300, so I have $1,400. $1,400, I have $1,500, so I have $1,600. $3,600, $3,800, $4,000, $4,200, $4,400, $4,600, $4,800, $5,000. $650, $700. Fair warning. Sold for $2,200.
When people at the auction found out I was Ruth Flower's granddaughter, they'd come seek me out just to meet me. With admiration in their voices, they'd say, "Oh, it must have been so wonderful playing in that house, growing up with all this. You are so lucky." She never really believed she'd run out of time. Maybe we're all like that. There will always be another day to make things right. So much for fairy tales.